Hello boys and girls, we're going to start reading another book today, and the book we're going to read is called Flat Stanley. It is by Jeff Brown, and it's a pretty exciting book. We're going to start reading it today. Chapter 1, The Big Bulletin Board. Breakfast was ready. "I'll go wake the boys," Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. "Hey, come and look! Hey!" Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were both very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. "Hay is for horses, Arthur." "Not people," Mr. Lambchop said as they entered the bedroom. "Try to remember that." "Excuse me," Arthur said, "but look!" He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay the enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lambchop had given the boys a Christmas ago, so that they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he had not been woken by his brother's shout. "What's going on here?" he called out cheerfully from underneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed. "Heavens!" said Mrs. Lambchop. "Oh," said Arthur, "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," Mr. Lambchop said. "Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say." In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley all over. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up," Stanley Lambchop said, "but I feel fine now." Look at Stanley, boys and girls. Look how thin he is. He is flat. "Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases," said Dr. Dan. "We'll just have to keep an eye on this young fellow," he said when he had finished the examination. "Sometimes we doctors, despite all our years of training and experience, can only marvel at how little we really know." Mrs. Lambchop said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by the tailor now, so Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Mrs. Lambchop wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about 1 foot wide, and half an inch thick. Look how skinny he was. Chapter 2, Being Flat. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed, just by laying down and sliding through the crack on the floor. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under the door, but just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him down through the bars and moved him carefully up and down and from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grafting. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second man. We have just caught a crazy lady." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him out and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A crazy lady indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We have been hasty. We see that now." Hasty means that they jumped to a conclusion a little too quickly. "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realized that was a good rule and said they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh, boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Excuse me. Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round trip on airplane ticket to California is very expensive," he said. "I'll have to think of a cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." In an envelope! The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over. Mrs. Lambchop discovered for an egg salad sandwich made with the bread and a toothbrush case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps in the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope along with the egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk, and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to stay folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it "Valuable" and "Fragile" and "This End Up" on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he had never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the Postal Service, and then that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Next time we will read chapter 3 and see if maybe even we can get close to the end of the book. What do you think about the book Flat Stanley so far? I think that it's been a fun book, but I also think that sometimes we can come up with silly things in our imagination. Do you think the story about Flat Stanley is real or fake? Well, talk to your parents about it, or even let me know. I'll see you later.